This is one of those purple passages of Scripture, isn't it, that everybody knows. Hebrews 11 is the chapter on faith, just as 1 Corinthians 13 is the chapter on love. It's a passage that people turn to a lot. And it's often turned to and preached in isolation. It's preached as a kind of launch pad to look at all these characters that are mentioned in this chapter throughout the Old Testament. And indeed, we've done just that here. I don't know whether we go back that far in our recordings, but we have done that. We've looked at all these people. It is a chapter full of the blessings that God has given to people in the past. It was the Puritan divine Richard Sibbes who called this passage a little book of martyrs, which I think is a fantastic description of this chapter, a little book of martyrs. However, this evening we have arrived at Hebrews 11 in the context of the rest of the book. And I want to try and see why the writer put this chapter here, why he wrote it the way he did, and what it actually says to us within its context. And hopefully we will get there. So this is not exhaustive, but it's an attempt to see what this passage really means, where it's put in this letter to the Hebrews, and indeed in the whole narrative of Scripture. Now, some of you will know that I rather like science. It's my background. I think of myself still, even now, as a scientist. Primarily, that's what I studied. And I like to think about science and to think about conundrums and all those kinds of things. I love to learn about relativity and quantum theory, two things that are absolutely fascinating. And, I could bore you silly on both those subjects, both of which are incredibly difficult, unbelievably difficult to understand. There was a guy called Arthur Eddington, Professor Arthur Eddington, I think he was in the 1960s, who was an expert, probably the world expert in his day, on Einstein's theory of general relativity. And he was giving a lecture about relativity, and after the lecture, somebody came up to him and said, "Professor Eddington, that was a wonderful lecture. You must be one of only 3 people in the world who understands general relativity." "Don't be modest," said Eddington, and then replied, "On the contrary, I'm trying to think who the third person is." Just think about that for a moment. I'm trying to think well, I'm not going to explain it, but it's one of those things, that's just so incomprehensible. Something else that's incomprehensible. The Nobel Prizes were announced this week. Don't worry, I'm not going to mention Donald Trump. But the Nobel Prize for Physics was awarded to 3 quantum scientists who did their work on something called quantum tunneling. Now, if you want to know what quantum tunneling is, let me explain briefly, okay? If you have a barrier and you try and push something through the barrier, you can't, okay? So, things don't fall through this lectern. If I put my Bible on this lectern, it doesn't fall through. At a quantum level, however, it is possible for things to go through impermeable barriers. Particles can appear where they're not meant to be. In fact, if you have an empty box, completely empty, it's a vacuum, there is nothing in it at all, with impermeable sides and top and bottom, and you put a particle detector in it, you will detect quantum particles appearing and disappearing as if by magic. It is the most bizarre, incredible, unbelievable thing. And these 3 scientists work on it, and whether they understand it or not is a different matter. Whether anybody understands it, people know what it does, how it does it. Well, there are all kinds of theories, but nobody really knows. See, with all those things, with relativity, if they didn't understand relativity, they'd have problems with sending rockets into space. If we didn't understand that quantum tunneling worked, you wouldn't have a mobile phone or a computer, because they use it all the time. It's an incredible thing. Can't explain it, but we know it's true. That's science for you. That is modern science, and that's why it is so interesting. So is there then such a massive difference between science and faith? There was a great and very witty scientist called Richard Feynman. Some of you will have heard of him. He said this: religion is about faith, science is about doubt. Do you think he's right? Religion is about faith, science is about doubt. I don't think he's right. I think science is just as much about faith as Christianity is. Because there's lots of things that we know are true, but we don't understand how, we don't know why, we just know they're there. Some people say that faith is believing what isn't true, and science is the opposite. It doesn't work that way. Some people say that faith is ignoring the difficult questions in life and just clinging on to other things and not really looking at what's really hard. Some people say that faith is trying really hard to believe things that you know in your heart aren't true. It's ridiculous. That's not what faith is. The writer to the Hebrews says this about faith. He says it is rooted in Jesus. See, if nothing else, the book of Hebrews is about Jesus, isn't it? From beginning to end. It's all about him. And the writer to the Hebrews shows how Jesus fits in and fills in and completes God's plan for his world. A plan that is revealed in Jesus. A plan that needs to be believed by faith. Because we trust in Jesus for the bits we can see and test. And by faith we believe that the other bits will follow. It's just like science. We trust that quantum tunneling works. We don't know how, we don't know why. We just know it does. That is a definition of faith. So when we arrive at chapter 11 here, we need to remind ourselves where it is that we have come from. And this book or letter or sermon or whatever it is, being written or preached to Jewish people, relies very heavily on the Old Testament, the Old Covenant. And unless you really have an understanding of the message of the Old Testament, you'll never really get to grips with the book of Hebrews. And over the last few weeks, we've been reading about the sacrificial system, the repetition of sacrifices, and the topology of the tabernacle and the temple, how it all works and how it points to something greater. We've been seeing how all of that reflects something that is more real than what looks real. It's a reflection, it's a type, it's an image of what is real in the heavenly places. The access to God, the blocking of that access by human sin, the sacrifice, the requirement of blood sacrifice to get to God, to be right with God, all that is an example fulfilled by Jesus of something that is more real than what we see around us. The more real thing is in heaven, more real than anything here on earth. It's very sad to hear about people dying, isn't it? And I managed to spend some time with Beryl on Friday night, which was a real joy and a privilege before she went to be in the place that is more real, not less real, not floating on a cloud, airy-fairy, but more real than what we see here. And she's there now, talking to Jesus. Isn't that just amazing? It's more real. But we don't see it, do we? We know it's more real, but we don't see it. We know it by faith. We believe it's true by faith. We look at the visual aids of the old covenant system, and that helps us to see by faith what is more real. We know it by faith, and so we stand firm in that faith. Look again at the end of chapter 10. Read from verse 36. The writer says this: "For you have need of endurance." It's one of the big messages in Hebrews. Endurance. "So that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. For yet a little while, and the coming one will come and will not delay. But my righteous one shall live by faith, and if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and persevere and preserve their souls." The writer to the Hebrews here is saying that we need to have faith to look for what is yet to come. And this isn't a new message. He's quoting not just one Bible passage in verses 37 and 38, but at least three, depending on which commentators you look at least three, maybe more, passages from Isaiah, from Haggai, but mostly from the book of Habakkuk. He's mixing them all together. That was a common Jewish technique of quoting from parts of the Bible, to show that it's not just one person that says this. This is the message of the whole of the Bible. Look, he says, it's from here and here and here and here. So it must be true. This is the great meta-narrative or overriding theme of the Bible. So, if this message is true, you need to stand firm, because we're not there yet. It's ready, waiting. Peter tells us that, doesn't he? Our inheritance in heaven, ready, waiting, the thing that is more real. But we need to stand firm in faith. What is faith? Chapter 11, verse 1. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. We hope that we will be in glory with Jesus. That's not a hope that we might be. It's a hope that is rooted and certain because Jesus has made it possible. That is our hope. We believe, even though we don't see it, we believe in it by faith. We have the conviction because of what Jesus has done and what his word tells us. We have the conviction that by faith our inheritance is ready and waiting for us. But we need that faith. The end of chapter 10, the writer tells us, if we don't have that faith, we're not going to get there. We're saved by grace through faith. Faith in God. So, having talked a little bit about faith like that, the writer or preacher then goes on to give some examples from the Old Testament. So we get this little book of martyrs, the characters from the Old Testament. Before that, he talks about faith in creation, which is always a good place to start. He says, by faith we understand, verse 3, that the universe was created by the word of God. God created the universe. There is an act of faith, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. God made the world. That's where we start. And then we have the first part of these martyrs. And rather than look at each of them in turn, I want to look at some themes that run through the first part of Hebrews 11 here. And the first theme is this one. All these martyrs obeyed God. That may sound obvious, but they were obedient to God, and God commended them for it. Abel obeyed God and offered the sacrifices that God required. Cain, his brother, cheated God and reaped the penalty for that. Enoch served God. Enoch is a very interesting character. Do turn back with me, will you, to Genesis chapter 4. In Judaism, Enoch is incredibly significant, even though there's only, I think, 5 verses, if that, in the whole Bible about him. He's very, very significant. They had a book which is not in the Bible, but it was read by Jewish people that's got the name of Enoch. It's called the Book of Enoch. It's a bit strange, but there it is. Enoch was such an important character for the people reading Hebrews. Now, we know hardly anything about him. If you look at Genesis chapter 5, you'll read about Enoch. Don't let your eyes stray to Genesis chapter 4, because that's another Enoch. There's another Enoch in Genesis chapter 4 who was a son of Cain, who has nothing to do with Hebrews. The Enoch we want to look at is chapter 5 and verse 18. When Jared had lived 162 years, he fathered Enoch. Jared lived, after he fathered Enoch, 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Jared were 962 years, and he died. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he fathered Methuselah. Enoch walked with God after he fathered Methuselah 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enoch were 365. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. That's it. That's all we have about Enoch. And so he was the father of Methuselah. You'll know Methuselah, the oldest man in the Bible, lived to 969 years. But here's Enoch, buried in the middle of these people. And all we know about Enoch is that he walked with God. And God took him. He walked with God. That's quite a commendation. We'll consider just in a moment why that is such an incredible commendation, why it's such a great commendation. We'll think about that. But what a great epitaph for Enoch. He walked with God, and he was not, because God took him. He obeyed God. Noah. Look at Genesis chapter 6 and verse 8. Things had got really bad in the world. And 6 verse 8 we read this, but Noah found favour in the eyes of the Lord. And Noah went on to be obedient. If he hadn't been obedient, he would have drowned with the rest of the world. He was obedient because he had faith in God. And then in verses 8 and 9 back in Hebrews 11, we read about Abraham, this great towering figure in the Old Testament, who was called out from his home, from his wealth and his comfort. And God said, up you get, Abraham. I want to go where I'm going to show you. I'm not going to tell you beforehand. Just go where I say. And off he went and lived in tents. We don't know how much he gave up, but it seems like it was quite a lot. From comfort to not knowing where he's going, living by faith, living towards the land of promise. And a promise is only a promise when you don't have it, isn't it? He never received it. It was a promise even when Abraham died. He died in faith with the promise still hanging. But he was obedient to God. That's the first thing. They were all obedient to God. The second thing is this: they all faced and ignored opposition. And it may well, in many cases, have been quite serious. We don't know all the details. But Abel was clearly opposed by his brother. In the first part of Genesis 4, we see how Cain was so jealous of Abel that because God was accepting Abel's sacrifices and not his. We don't know how Cain knew that, but he did. He was jealous of Abel, and by all accounts, he was opposing. He would have opposed what Abel was doing. Otherwise, he wouldn't have ended up murdering him, would he? He was opposed to Abel, but Abel stood firm, even to the point of death. He stood against his brother's anger. He stood against opposition. He was obedient in the face of opposition. When we come to Enoch, we see by implication that he was standing in the face of opposition, because that list of people in Genesis 5 and into Genesis 6 is a list of human failure. Even after the Garden of Eden, things got worse and worse and worse. Cain killed Abel, things got worse and worse. They descended until in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 5, we see that God looked down and he saw that the world was so evil, he decided to destroy it. That's when Noah found, when God found Noah. Bear in mind, Enoch was Noah's great-grandfather. So we can surmise that things were pretty bad in Enoch's day. He ignored opposition. He walked with God. Even in days like that, he walked with God. Do you think that was easy? Do you think it was easy for Abel to stand against his brother's anger and jealousy? And what about Noah? God called him and God gave him a task which seemed a ridiculous task, building a boat, nowhere near any water, and all we know the story well, don't we? And we can guess that because in Genesis 6 the world was so bad, there must have been a lot of opposition to Noah. I mean, I know it's only guesswork, and but it's probably the case that people would have mocked him. They'd have said, "What on earth do you think you're doing, wasting your time on this?" And Noah said, "I'm being obedient to God. I'm doing what God says. May seem ridiculous to you, but I have faith that God knows what he is doing. And I'm doing it for his glory." So they all obeyed God. They all ignored opposition. And the third thing from this first group of people is this: none of them, not one of them, is seeking earthly reward. Not one of them. The reward for them is being obedient to God. That's reward enough. For Abel, it led to his death. For Enoch, he was taken out of the situation. For Noah, he was given a task to do. But none of them had any earthly reward. For Abraham, he became a traveller, a wanderer, all his life. He never saw the promise that God had given to him fulfilled. He didn't seek earthly reward. He simply sought to be obedient to God. Now, there is such a lot here. But for us, the writer to the Hebrews is saying, stand firm in faith, because Jesus has made it possible for you to enter the heavenly places by his blood. That's what he's been saying up till chapter 10. Jesus has done it. But you have to believe that by faith, because we won't see it in the here and now. We'll see it when we go to be with him. Too many Christians are obedient to God, if indeed they are, because they think it makes them look good. Perhaps in the church. Even amongst Christian brothers and sisters like us, there can be a kind of spiritual pride. Look how good I'm being. Look what a good Christian life I'm living. That's not what it's about. If that's the way you are with your obedience to God, you're likely to buckle under persecution. You're not going to stand like Abel did, or Enoch did, or Noah did, or Abraham did. Because your obedience is for you. It's not for God. That kind of obedience expects and seeks earthly reward, not a heavenly reward. See, we're obedient to God because we love God. Our faith is in him. Isn't it better to live for what is truly real? That thing which we don't yet see fully, that we see it as the Apostle Paul said, through a glass darkly. One day we'll see him face to face. One day we'll be where it is truly real, with God in glory, because Jesus has made it possible. So stand firm, hold fast, says the writer to the Hebrews. Whatever the cost, stand firm. Let's bow our heads to pray.